The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I've got Dr. Colin Morgan, who's the Business Development Director for ADAS. ADAS are an agricultural and environmental consultancy, and Colin is helping farmers to understand all things hemp. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you, Anuj. Great to be here.
Pleasure. So I have mentioned a few times on the show that I've caught the hemp bug, so I'm really keen to do more stuff on hemp and showcase the wonderful material to our listeners. Would you mind starting with sort of a bit about what ADAS is and what you do for them?
Yeah, certainly. So ADAS is a very interesting organisation. It actually was established by the government after the Second World War. And it was actually, back then it was called NAAS, NAAS, the National Agricultural Advisory Service. And it was part of the government's effort to feed the nation after the Second World War. You'll recall there was rationing and food shortages. And NAAS back then was set up to work with farmers and improve productivity of food across the nation, literally to feed us. And over the years, it's always been operated under the government as part of the Ministry of Agriculture, etc. And then it had a name change to ADAS, which essentially, we don't really use the acronym too much now, but it stands for Agricultural Development and Advisory Service. And for most of its life, it's been about supporting farmers based on good quality research, we're independent, and good levels of knowledge of agriculture and the land. Back in the 90s, ADAS was spun out from the government, like many organisations, government privatisations, etc. Mm-hmm. But we really retained our ethos about good research and good support for the agricultural community. ADAS, fast forward a little bit, ADAS is now owned by an amazing company called RSK. It's still a private organisation. RSK is getting on for 4,000 employees across the UK and internationally. It was set up by a small team led by a gentleman called Alan Ryder, who is still, proud to say, our leader. And basically, a couple of years ago, Alan recognised the value in ADAS and bought it from its then owners, and the organisation has gone on from strength to strength. We have 400 people in the business, in this part of the business, ADAS.
Brilliant.
And they basically do research into crops or animal husbandry, for instance. We do farmer guidance, advisory work, consultancy. We also do contract work in part of the business as well. So we have a very research-heavy approach. We work with lots of organisations such as Innovate UK, part of the government. We have many government customers, and we also do a lot of private work as well. But all the way, the ethos is about what we can do to add to society in terms of protecting the environment, enhancing the environment, and feeding the nation and beyond.
Brilliant. That sounds like a really amazing remit. And what do you personally do as part of that?
So I'm the Business Development Director in our Sustainable Food and Farming team. And the Sustainable Food and Farming team particularly is all about creating sustainable agricultural solutions. So many of the challenges we face today are around, as we know, pressures on the land, partly as a result of intensive farming. So for instance, we'll work with helping food companies in particular to understand the impact of their agricultural production. So we help them work down their value chain. We're particularly interested in helping them to measure their impacts, their inputs and their outputs. We do a lot of analysis work for them. And then we basically turn that measurement and analysis into strategy and communications. You'll know really over the past 10 years in particular, and of course recently because of the climate work in London now, that despite Brexit, the impact on the environment is a significant challenge we're going to have to tackle. And at the forefront of this is agriculture, particularly if you look at sectors like beef and dairy. The big players all want to reduce their impact from food production. So basically getting to a point where we protect and enhance the environment and feed ourselves healthy diets sustainably. So the work that I do is develop business in this area for a a really knowledgeable team of sustainable agricultural experts. The wider team around, we do all sorts of work with soil, crops and water, agricultural land management, biotech, chemicals in the environment, and as well as actually working with the sustainable food and farming team. There are times when I get involved in other projects or members of the team as well. So with 400 people across ADAS, there's a lot of multidisciplinary work as we deliver solutions for customers.
Brilliant. And do you get involved in policy at all? So, I mean, are the government sort of incentivising good behaviour through grants and subsidies?
It's a really interesting area, policy, actually, because within ADAS we actually have a policy team as well. They're the policy and economics team. And one of the things actually we're really interested in doing, and we've spoken to a couple of cannabis organisations, is taking a good independent look at the potential value to the UK economy from widespread cultivation of legal cannabis for various outcomes. And we think there's an interesting piece of work to be done there. Now, at this point in time, there's been no central funding from government. It's probably fair to say for organisations that fund research, a lot of it has been done into the mainstay crops such as wheat and so on. The funding for that kind of work hasn't really reached the cannabis space yet, not from the government anyway, but there's certainly an opportunity to have good, well-researched, independent advice to the government, which the policy and economics team in ADAS would do a very good job of.
Brilliant. So let's move on a bit to speak more specifically about cannabis and hemp then. What work have you been doing in relation to that, and what sort of made you and ADAS start looking at this area?
So it's very interesting. So ADAS, throughout its history, have been involved in many different crops, as you'd expect. And despite particular crops such as wheat, etc., being around what feels like forever, of course, there's always new work to be done about varieties, about growing conditions, about climate change, the impact, etc. And what tends to happen is, as we look at different crops, there's always a novel crop, if you like, that's of interest that perhaps could be grown here because of climate change or what have you. And about a year ago, we started extending our gaze, in addition to the traditional crops, to other crops as well. And we started looking at cannabis a little bit more in detail about it being a potential. And it was really around about the time when it was possible under law, November the 1st last year, to be prescribed for medical purposes. And we'd seen increasing news in the media. But what we actually thought was, there's a piece of the jigsaw missing here. People may be talking about the control side of the illegal market, which, as we know, is a challenge. They were either talking about the highly controlled crops grown under glass for the pharmaceutical companies. There was conversations about the CBD market, which was exploding in interest. But really underpinning all that, there was a voice absent in the marketplace from a good organisation that had got a history on understanding plants and crops. So the first thing we did, we discussed it and said, what are the potential environmental consequences of growing cannabis in various different ways in the UK? And then what are the potential opportunities of growing the crop? And it was really at the same time we were looking at other aspects. There's been a lot of concern from people about dairy, for instance, and the impact of cattle, basically, and particularly in relation to carbon. And what people have been doing in some numbers is switching to other varieties of plant-based alternatives such as soy or almond. And of course, one of the drinks in that marketplace as well is hemp-based drinks. And bringing all this together really caught our attention. We said, well, people can see cannabis in many different ways. Essentially, it's a plant. Despite how people feel about it, it still has characteristics that probably need more knowledge on them. And we felt that we could apply our presence in the marketplace, expertise and trust people are having us to this particular crop. So what we did was we launched a web page with my picture on it there. And very quickly, actually, I found that we got inundated with inquiries.
Just because of your picture?
Absolutely, just because of my picture. People saying, why have you got that picture on there? But actually, it was the first time probably ever that I'd ever publicly had the word cannabis connected to my name. And I'll tell you a quick anecdote. About the time we launched our website, I went round to see my mum at the weekend with the family, and she said, how are you doing? How's work at ADAS? And I says, it's great. She says, what are you working on? I said, I'm working in cannabis. And rather expect, my mum's in her 70s now, rather expecting this to be a bit of a surprise, she goes, I've got some cannabis tea in the cupboard. Do you fancy a cup?
Fantastic.
So we had a conversation about it then, and the benefits of, obviously it's a perfect legal drink she had.
Yes.
And that to me was a bit of a litmus test of where the recognition of the crop was in the marketplace. And, if your mom's drinking it in the 70s as a tea at bedtime, that's something.
That's brilliant. I mean, you just slightly stolen my thunder because that's my traditional last question. What did your parents say?
I got there early.
That's great.
Yeah, well, she's very interested in it, actually. And she's also, since then, she's used some CBD balms. And there was one of the events I spoke at earlier in the year, and they actually came and observed me, which was quite interesting talking about this. So in a way, it's the kind of stigma part of it had kind of evaporated a little bit. But for us, actually, in ADAS, the most important thing was to say, we can offer a service, let's test the water, let's see what inquiries we're having, and we'll take it from there. And really, it's been a very interesting evolution from that point.
Brilliant. And that's quite forward-thinking, I think, that you sort of spotted it at that time. It feels that sometimes with institutions or older institutions, there's a wait and see, or there's an initial resistance or a conservatism. So it sounds like you guys were fairly kind of forward thinking.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. Well, the great thing of being at ADAS is it's full of people who love the land. They love plants, they love agriculture by their very nature, they're devoted to it, and they're very inquisitive people. So actually a new crop comes along which could be cultivated, and they actually really want to know, how does it grow? How do we harvest it? How do we process it? What are the likely pests that you may get on it? How can it be treated? How can it grow in different conditions across the UK? And all of a sudden it becomes really fascinating from a scientific perspective. As long as you act legally and morally and don't get into any challenging situations, because we're a very reputable organisation, then the rest is basically a scientific question. And then it becomes, well, for instance, if you take hemp for, let's say, a hempcrete product, for instance, or a biomaterial based, what are the processes at the end of harvesting? And for many people in the organisation, these have become very interesting scientific questions that we can support on for objective and independent research.
Yeah.
Particularly when the plants are at the very early stages. We haven't done any of these crop trials yet, but for instance, at the location I'm at in Boxworth in Cambridgeshire, we have big polytunnels on at any particular time. We're doing various pieces of work there for other clients. And this is a perfect space we can use, for instance, in due course for doing crop trials of cannabis varieties for various different purposes. And many of the scientists there would be interested in the plant itself because it's cannabis, but fundamentally they actually like to see which things grow in which conditions and how they can improve that performance.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. I think when it comes to cultivators, all the people I've met, they're quite sort of agnostic, I guess, in terms of what's growing. They find the plant fascinating and all the things you just said. Whereas with the medical profession, you've got the scientists who are really interested in it, but there is a slight resistance from the establishment, I think, to recognise the medical side of cannabis. So it's quite an interesting contrast, I think. So moving on, just, to give a high-level summary for the audience, why do you think we should be growing hemp in the UK from a sustainability perspective?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to look backwards before we look forwards. So, of course, as everybody will tell you, there has been a long tradition of growing hemp in the UK. And in fact, during my holidays this year, I was up near the village of Diss, the small town of Diss in Norfolk. And literally just outside of there, there's this big village green. And my family and I were on holiday up there, and we stopped there for, a little picnic. And we're reading the board, the kind of information board on this really huge green just outside of Diss. And there was actually pictures there about, back a couple of 100 years ago. One of the traditions they had on that very green was processing hemp. And there it was. There was no razzmatazz around this border. And this was basically a matter of fact, this used to be done here. And it may not necessarily be because of hemp itself, but if you go out in that area, there are also villages with hemp in the word as well. So there is a tradition in the UK, and obviously for one reason or another, as we know, politically, prohibition-wise, etc., it has got a reputation. But in terms of the vital statistics about how it grows in the UK, it definitely has a role to play as another crop in the landscape. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was out on a visit with some farmers up in Northamptonshire, interestingly enough, and they had the crops at various stages. Of course, they were growing for the classic stalk and the seeds under the industrial hemp license regime, and the crop was really tall. They'd of course used no fertilizers on it, no crop control, pesticides or have you, and it was a pretty healthy looking crop. And what they'd done is they'd packed in it at various densities because they were doing some trial work on it for various outputs. So I think there's a very interesting role for the crop to play. At the moment, it's still a very niche crop, and it will stay this way up until we have some deregulation from government. Now, the biggest challenges really are in terms of it being a very useful, valuable, wide-scale crop, are really around, number one, the industrial hemp aspects of it. Two, the flower, of course, because of what has to be done to the flower at the minute. We can't yield that for CBD, for instance. And really the third one is post-farm processing. If you've got those infrastructures correct around those particular 3 points, then it may well be an interesting crop to expand upon in the UK, and could well be, post-Brexit, a very interesting crop for farmers to grow, to add to their rotation for other benefits. And what's really interesting, I think, is it's a bit of a convergence of events at the moment. So we know that climate is a serious problem. And I think once we get past Brexit, I think we'll get to focus much more on that. You've got aspects such as the Agriculture Bill, which started its life in Parliament 2018. These talk about the need for sustainable agriculture, public money for public goods being a reward system, and the fact that we've got issues around plastic pollution and the use of materials. Now, all of these things could come together to create a really perfect opportunity for the cultivation of cannabis in the UK landscape.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a few times on the show about the kind of sustainability credentials of cannabis and hemp in relation to carbon sequestration and phytoremediation of the soil, and obviously the fibres being able to use for alternatives to plastics, etc. So, you know, there's a massive case for hemp, but really interesting that you summed it up in the challenges as well, that not being able to use the buds for CBD when we're able to import them seems a bit mental at the moment. The analogy is growing apple trees for the wood and throwing away the apples, because I can imagine that's a real financial incentive for the farmers, or not incentive, disincentive, I suppose, for the farmers, but also the infrastructure that you mentioned, that we're not there yet on that level.
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge, actually. I think the number one of the key problems you've identified is the use of the flowers for CBD oil production. Now, CBD oil production at the moment is, as we know, it's rocketing. We've had some really big events over the last year or two, which are really incredibly well attended. But one thing I observe on these events is that a lot of the organisations there, the big ones, are typically North American companies. Now, there's no way whatsoever that, given the opportunity, we couldn't have that production here in the UK. And I think there's money waiting to come in. And what better when you've got a situation, particularly in Brexit, where you'd like to be able to cultivate more of everything in the UK where possible. That should be a perfect opportunity to do that. And then actually what we could do is that would open up the marketplace economically, I think, for some of the extra infrastructure it needs to. And actually, from an ADAS perspective, you mentioned carbon sequestration, phytoremediation, these points, and I hear these often. It would be really super to be able to do some more comprehensive work on phytoremediation and carbon sequestration. At the moment, of course, there are some research papers on it. There's a very notable one in Italy around phytoremediation. There have been reports about Chernobyl having cannabis grown there for this as well. But I think really we cannot realise these opportunities until we have those points in the marketplace. But I do understand, of course, it has to be done well. I'd like to see a position whereby we have a really fantastic homegrown crop. It's underpinned by really good agricultural practices and agricultural knowledge. It gives the farming community another option about an additional crop to grow. And particularly after the agriculture bill, assuming we get that post-Brexit, that farmers are able to actually say, as part of my public money for public goods, I'm going to plant up some cannabis, and most importantly, not only anecdotal evidence or a bit of hearsay, there is objective scientific evidence that underpins those particular factors, And what we really need to know, and we don't know it yet, is when you have whole fields of cannabis grown, let's say for industrial purposes, and you take the flower, etc., what impact does that really have on the soil? What impact does it have on biodiversity? What can you do in the kind of farmscape and landscape around those crops in order to be able to literally put back into the environment? And there, I think, the really interesting policy and economic questions that could make a difference in due course. I don't think we're there yet, but I think a lot of people have that vision.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way you describe that. I mean, it feels to me, from a lot of what you're describing, it's essential to have this crop being grown in the UK for wider reasons than just the crop itself in terms of environmental factors. When I look at cannabis and hemp, often when you're talking about it on large scales, people talk about the fact that it will naturally gravitate towards lower cost producers with better climates. And perhaps that's true in terms of mass production, but it sounds like it's really important for us to have a hemp economy in the UK as well.
It makes absolutely perfect sense, doesn't it? If you want to be sustainable, a fundamental principle of sustainability is local sourcing. And it's not only the kind of plastics, the CBD oil or the medical cannabis, but actually if you look at the oil, hemp seed oil for instance, that could be a really interesting crop. It's very nutritious. At the moment, we often think of hemp actually a bit like rapeseed. So if you were to go back 30 or 40 years ago, there wouldn't be much rapeseed planted. And now actually a lot of the rapeseed that we're producing actually ends up as nice local artisanal products. And you often, say if you go to some kind of food fair or anything, you'll see what you call cold pressed rapeseed oil. And there's always a little bit of narrative on the back of it. There's a really great producer, for instance, I've got in mind in Northamptonshire, and they're able to tell the story about the biodiversity, about supporting pollinators, and then they're able to actually produce all of that in a low impact, low input way, and produce a really highly nutritious rapeseed oil, which is easily on a par, if not more nutritious and possibly better for you than an olive oil. And actually only today, interesting enough, on Farming Today, as I was coming down to London, they were talking about rapeseed-based meal being fed basically to cows as one way to kind of give them a nutritious diet as a good alternative to soy. And what you really have to do with all of this is think about where other crops, for whatever purposes, are coming to the UK, and ask yourself if we can do it in the UK more sustainably. Then by definition that's a double win, because you've got more sustainable agricultural practices and you've got the fact you've got lower food miles. The reason why I talk about the rapeseed and going to the cows and about local production is because I don't know the answer to this one yet, but you could potentially have a hemp seed oil doing that too. And hemp seed again is very good for culinary purposes. You can already very respectfully go and buy it at Waitrose, good hemp for instance, and if you can imagine, if the claims made for the crops are what they say they are, and we'd like to test that really much more scientifically, more rigorously, then you could potentially have a really wonderful crop here which produces many things, produced right on our doorstep for the economy and for the environment.
Yeah, a really, really, really compelling case. Where in the UK do you think the demand is coming from at the moment for hemp, notwithstanding the fact that we can't use the CBD that comes from hemp?
Well, where we're seeing a lot of demand from all over, but a lot of it tends to come from the east of the country, and particularly there, more arable land, particularly, and they're obviously growing other crops at the minute, predominantly, wheat, or then sometimes some potatoes or what have you, these kind of typical crops, and they're actually saying, okay, well, hemp could be a good alternative crop. Maybe I can do it as a kind of rotation crop. So a couple of years of the normal crops, put a crop of hemp in. And it's really interesting because you've had many inquiries from many parts of the country. But I would say if you were to do a kind of heat map on this, a lot of it would be from the east, Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, etc. Now, one of the things that ADAS do is a lot of work in what you call protected food status brands, protected food names, PFN. And it's been really interesting, actually, because over in Wales, there's a lot of money going into those kind of brands. The Welsh Government are really supporting enhancement of Welsh food brands. It's really quite impressive. And potentially after Brexit, this concept of protected food names, we're going to have to keep something in the UK because a lot of those schemes are, of course, underpinned by Europe. The classic Melton, Mab report, pie, etc. Now, it's quite interesting. So I've thought about this a few times. I thought, if ever the naming, provenance naming, was extended beyond food, I've even heard it could be applied to all sorts of materials. Could be applied to brick, for instance, particular bricks from a particular area. But it could also be applied to other things. And it could well be applied to cannabis. Imagine in a future where, people are really wanting to talk about provenance and traceability and sustainability. Imagine kind of like a protected food name type status or an extension of that. You could have Cambridgeshire cannabis, for instance, grown out there in the fens with beautiful quality soil, and it's got a real heritage around it over the years to come. And you never know, you may have, the best quality hemp seed oils coming from the fens, and renowned around the world for these great crops. But I think the most important thing is what would underpin it is good quality work, good quality practices, both in terms of the environment and looking after workers, beautiful production methods, so you're producing really high quality produce, and in a part of the world which is clean and fresh, etc. Now, bringing all these things together as a kind of protected, perhaps food status in that case of hemp seed oil, would be a really interesting case.
Yeah.
And I think for me it kind of really inspires me to help the sector, and working with ADAS to help the sector, to basically say all of those things that need to be known to make good agricultural practices, we could help that come to reality. And the one thing really that needs to be fixed is, post-Brexit, I think needs to be fixed so we get past it.
Brexit needs to be fixed.
Well, actually, I say post-Brexit needs to be fixed because while we're thinking about Brexit, of course, we really need to be thinking really what we're going to do afterwards for everything. And what's really interesting about the agriculture bill is it sets some of those seeds, which actually I think we could plant the cannabis into as a really interesting crop. So I think you've got to look a couple of years down the line and say, well, if the government realised the potential value of it, but still regulated the stuff that could be problematic in the short term, then we've got a real opportunity with this crop. Yeah,
I love the fact that you've sort of talked about that, because I think, like I said, the low-cost countries argument probably makes sense on a mass scale, but I think there is an opportunity to have a really healthy, thriving domestic cultivation industry in a kind of craft sense as much as anything else. So it's great. It's good that you think the same way.
Absolutely. I mean, you can have global and local, and I think one of the things about the environmental movement is really funny now. I think Boris Johnson had a quote overnight, and I think he said paraphrasing, I haven't seen the exact quote, but something along the lines of the protesters are hemp. They smell of hemp and they live in bivouacs or something to this effect. I thought it was really interesting how you use the word, they kind of smell of hemp. And I thought that's a really interesting worldview, actually, because what we really need to look at, I think, is the impact we're having, understand how we can make it better for all of us environmentally. And I think the answer, actually, in terms of the landscape and the countryside in the UK and these crops we could grow, is right under our nose in our case. And I think if we had the capability to look at crops like hemp in a much more interesting way with the right regulatory framework, I think it might provide a great deal of our solutions that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think that quote says more about Boris Johnson than the environmental movement, but less said about that, the better. Cool, so you've stolen my thunder with telling me about your mum and her views on cannabis, which is great. But have you... My final question would be around, have you had to overcome much stigma from the wider agricultural community for investigating and promoting this crop?
I think the most interesting thing is to say, actually, the wonderful thing about being an ADAS, because it used to be part of the government machinery as essentially civil servants, we're always very careful and objective and independent. So we would never, we never lobby. We never want to publicly pull anybody down. And it really gives us a strong and objective position. So basically what we're interested in is knowing that more needs to be known about this crop, knowing that we have the tools to bring to it. And we think, and this is the interesting point about the stigma, is if it's managed correctly and with good agricultural practices that are underpinned by proper knowledge, and the case is made based on that scientific evidence, then we think that overcomes any stigmatisation. But finally, in terms of one of the things that has surprised me actually, is as I've been to many cannabis-related events, I've now got to the point now actually where we're often recognised as being part of that community. And I still think we're fairly unique in what we bring to the table, which is a wonderful position to be in. And because we have the ear of the farmers and vice versa, they trust us and we listen to them. That's given us some really interesting conversations. And of course, when we first went into the marketplace, a few people said to us, ADAS and cannabis, how did that happen? Or what's that all about? And very quickly, when we start explaining, well, it's another crop. We know as farmers, it could be a good cash crop for you. You need to know more about the practices, everything from sowing to maintenance to harvesting and post-harvest. And who better to work with you on that journey of knowledge than ADAS? And we think that very quickly removes any stigma. And in fact, now, if anything, I'd say the reverse is the case. And people find it very interesting. And we think as long as we, both the industry and ADAS, to support the industry, do things the right way, with passion, but objectively and independently, and we think that will help remove the stigma in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any kind of support and promotion from institutions and organisations like yourself just adds much more legitimacy to the whole industry and overcomes those stigmas and changes perception. So I think it's great that you guys are getting involved.
Thank you. And one of the things we're really looking to do actually is that I mentioned earlier in the interview, there's Innovate UK is a funding stream where governments release pots of money basically, which can be used for innovative purposes. And what tends to happen in these, you build a consortium, and ADAS will often work with universities and other commercial operators, both in the UK and overseas. We're currently looking at the moment to do a project in Africa, interestingly enough. But actually, any of those projects, when we see them come out, the rounds of funding, we're very keen to see if there's any opportunities to partner with other organisations on some significant scale research. And we think really bringing those additional partners together, particularly when you've got other higher education establishments as well, will really help enrich that space. I think more than anything, actually, at the minute, what's needed is, if I can characterise this very quickly, basically a lot of excitement about cannabis at the moment, which is very exhilarating. And actually, in terms of the meetings I've been to in the past year, some of the most exhilarating I've had for years. But there is a need, actually, to move beyond some of that exhilaration now and be more fact-based. And probably one of the most interesting events I've seen is whereby there was a bit of a debate at the end, and I thought people were being a little bit over-passionate about the topic, and they were losing their perspective. And I actually made this point. I said, look, I think you won't win the argument if you only emote. I think you need to underpin it by some good technical knowledge as well. And it was quite funny. They turned around and said, you haven't got it. What do you mean? What are you talking about? I said, you're making my point for me. It's great to have passion. It's great to have emotion. It's great to have a vision. But I think it needs to be underpinned by good facts and objectivity. And I think that will help win arguments of people who see it with stigma, but it'll also paint the picture as it really is.
Sure.
So I think what I really ultimately see is basically next couple of years, post-Brexit, the need to really look more deeply at all of these areas, take a serious look at how the plastics could be used, for instance, actually invest in those, get some perhaps government funding through Innovate, etc., cross-collaboration approaches, make sure we've got good standards in place, and then really be able to use that high levels of technical knowledge we have in the UK to build some of these things we dream of now. And I think that'd be a really good situation. I'm very excited, actually, Anuj, to be looking back in a couple of years' time at the journey we've made.
Brilliant, brilliant. I love everything you just said there. I'm a big and passionate promoter of balance when it comes to this, and I think that's exactly how we sort of overcome those stigmas. So,
very important.
So thank you for that. Colin, it's been really great to have you on the show, and I would look forward to having you back on the show next year or the year after, whenever, to see how we've developed in the UK.
Anuj, great. I'm hoping there'll be a good story to tell, and I'd really love to come back and meet you again then and have another interview. Super, thank you for having me.
Cool, cheers.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for that. Great to see a historical organisation like ADAS looking at this sector, and great to hear Colin's views on it. Really positive supporter. And I hope the law actually changes. I expect it's probably one of the 1,000 things that's being put on hold because of Brexit, but I hope the law changes soon after all that's resolved to allow hemp farmers to actually use the buds from the hemp plant to make CBD, because it's a massive incentive for farmers to get more involved. On a personal front, things are going very well with New Leaf Insights. For those that don't know, that's the strategic advisory firm that I've set up, which is helping companies and investors understand, enter and succeed in the cannabis space, talking to some really interesting people. But as ever, if you are needing any help in the cannabis space, please do drop me a line. We'd love to try and help you. Got some interesting guests coming up in the next few weeks, but for the moment, I'll leave you. Please remember to rate, like, share, do all those great things, and I will see you next week. Cheers.